Exploding government debt is taking over, forcing countries into policies not for jobs and inflation, but for the debt. For months now, Donald Trump has been hammering Jerome Powell to cut rates because of exploding interest payments on our $36 trillion national debt. One tweet berated, quote, "Too late, Powell," for costing $360 billion per year for every point of interest rates. Of course, that's just federal debt. Toss in state, local, and private debt, and it's closer to $570 billion of additional debt payments for every point of interest rates. Meanwhile, in Britain, the government just announced fresh tax hikes on top of the biggest tax hike in a generation to convince investors that Britain can actually handle deficits over 5% of GDP. Note, the U.S. is actually worse. We're over 6% deficit. But then we have the world's reserve currency that Britain lost specifically because of out-of-control spending 100 years ago. I also mentioned in a recent video, Japan's prime minister said they can never again cut taxes because the debt is too big. So this all raises the specter of something called fiscal dominance, where debt gets so big that it takes over economic policy, meaning the Fed cannot raise rates and governments cannot cut taxes. In fact, they're forced into tax hikes. There's a problem for a couple reasons. First off, fiscal dominance castrates central banks because if debt interest is big enough, rate hikes stimulate the economy while cuts strangle it. The debt payments go down. That cancels the Fed's main tools. Second, fiscal dominance forces long-term inflation because central banks are forced into low rates and even money printing QE to finance the debt. Third, and most important, fiscal dominance means central banks cannot stop runaway inflation. To see why, consider what happened in the 1970s inflation. At the time, there was concern that central banks had terminally lost the plot. It was game over, the dollar would collapse, millions wiped out, and we would go back to gold. Of course, that didn't happen because Fed Chair Paul Volcker jacked interest rates to 19%, levels we had not seen since the Civil War hyperinflation. 19% gutted the economy, of course, but it stopped inflation in its tracks. It reassured bond investors that there is a 19% parachute if inflation hits the fan. The problem is back in the 70s, even adjusting for inflation, the national debt was 10 times smaller. Today, it's 120% of GDP. That means we cannot do the Volcker thing today. There is no parachute. To illustrate, the current deficit is around $2 trillion, of which half, $1.1 trillion, is debt interest. If inflation got out of control and the Fed hiked to 19%, the first year alone $10 trillion of debt goes from 3% interest to 19% interest, 6 times higher. That takes the deficit from $2 trillion to $3.5 trillion in just 12 months. Give it another 2 years, and the deficit hits nearly $5 trillion, which is almost 20% of GDP. There is no way investors are buying a 20% deficit. Countries like Turkey or Sri Lanka blow out at 10, meaning the Fed has to step in as buyer of last resort, printing every penny, which makes the inflation worse. In short, the Volcker parachute that's backstopping the entire Ponzi is gone. Congress spent it. The last man standing is Weimar Germany. The Fed literally prints the deficit. So as stacks brought to you by I Trust Capital, as Lynn Alden puts it, nothing stops this train. Congress missed their chance. Reserve currency could buy another decade or two as foreigners absorb the fresh dollars, or our entire financial system is now flying without a parachute. Read the rest with charts and all the gory details at profitandloss.com. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.